Yeah, I mean, what I really want to do today is really pitch the whole project that is, the diversity reading list in philosophy. We're a website, but we're also a little bit broader than this, a community and a sort of hub for diversifying and decolonizing and making philosophy generally more inclusive. So the idea is to kind of, pitch the whole project as a whole. And so what I'm going to do is kind of go back and forth between my slides and the website to show you kind of in practice how certain elements of the website kind of work and how you can use it and so on and so forth. Afterwards, I'm really excited to hear and discuss with you your experiences maybe in teaching or learning or researching philosophy or participating in any kind of way in these sort of diversity practices and philosophy. So for me, that's going to be really a highlight today. And before I start, I think, this intro is getting quite long, but before I start, I really want to say that, everything I'm presenting today, every aspect of the project I'm talking about, every piece of research I'm going to mention is really not a reflection of just my work, but a reflection of a huge collective effort of some people who are team members of the diversity reading list, like Bjorn, but also people kind of beyond that. And the point here is really that the goal is to be effective in diversifying philosophy. And given that there are loads of people around us who are interested in this, really bringing people together, highlighting other people's work in that sense, and putting it in a platform where it can all be accessed this way is really important to us. So really, that's just kind of my cheesy shout out to a lot of other scholars. Right. So what I'm going to do today is very simply tell you a little bit about the why we started diversity, or I didn't start it, Simon started it. Why start a diversity reading list in philosophy in the first place? What are the challenges, which I'm sure you know, but about, but just to sort of add a little bit of data to the idea of what we're trying to challenge. I'll talk about the what we do really and how we do it, which is really the core of the presentation, and the who's involved. Once again, I think that's important to highlight that, and how, maybe if you want to be involved, this is going to be the recruitment pitch as well. Anyway, this is I'm going to present now some of the data that we have used to support ourselves and justify our project. This is something we aim to update on a regular basis. You can find it on our website, but this is some research that is regularly updated. So the last time we updated this research or sourced these figures was in 2022. I'm sure there's more things that have come out and more things that need to be included and paid attention to. But yeah, first, to talk a little bit about gender disparity in philosophy. In the US, women constitute only 25% of Philosophical Gourmet Report ranked faculty, 29% of recently placed PhDs and of recently graduated philosophy PhDs, and 24% of the APA members who reported their gender. So that's based in the US. I'm based in the UK, Simon's based in Germany. The DRL is not meant to be a kind of localized in any specific place, but given the prominence of Western philosophy in these two countries and their kind of, university structure, this is currently what we're focusing on, but it's not a necessity. Anyway, in the UK, things are only slightly better. In 2021, which was the most recent BPA SWIP report, women constituted 30% of permanent staff, which was up from 24% in 2011 when the previous report was published. 33% of recently placed PhDs, up from 31% in 2011, and 32% of recently graduated PhDs. But the drop-off from undergraduate to master's to PhD level has remained the same. That's the leaky pipeline effect, which I'll talk about more in a sec as well. Meanwhile, only 13% of authors published in top American and British philosophical journals are women. Now, to discuss racial and ethnic disparities, again in the US, in 2017 till 2019, none of the PhDs who graduated in the US were Indigenous American or Alaskan natives. 3% were Black or African American, 4% were Asian, and 6% were Hispanic, and 3% were either more than one race or an unrecognized race, according to Eric Schwitzgebel et al. 2021. Only 0.32% of US authors of research publications in top philosophy journals are Black. Only 1.32% of philosophy faculty are Black. No systematic data is currently available in the UK, unfortunately, but there's some discussion in certain blog posts and publications. What is definitely obvious is that there's less than 1% permanent Black philosophy faculty member in the UK. And more specifically, there appear to be only 6. So yeah, this is 2019. It might have gone up by 1 or 2 potentially, but yes, I think we can all agree this is dire, and this is not even capturing, racial and ethnic diversities. It's now. The big metaphors we often use to discuss this data is the leaky pipeline and the perfect storm. We can discuss also the extent to which these metaphors are appropriate, but the leaky pipeline effect being that the representation of women in racial ethnic group is generally higher at undergraduate level, but decreases through master's, PhD level, and then further throughout career progression. And regarding the perfect storm, a number of factors contribute, which tend to wash out non-male and non-white students out of the discipline. One of these factors is the stereotype of the philosopher as a white man, which is granted by the fact that in the syllabus, what is represented as being philosophy, being worthy of being on a syllabus and taught at these institutions are white men, and that the philosophical ideals of rationality, objectivity associated with maleness and whiteness. This is an argument that famously Haslinger has made. Again, I think there is a lot to be said about this data in that it is often sporadic, ought to be completed. It's also very often heavily quantitative in nature rather than qualitative. And that is also something we're looking at. And hopefully I'm currently on a research project with the University of Manchester to sort of patch up the missing data and also focus heavily on qualitative data. And yeah, on the experience of studying, teaching, researching philosophy. As we know as well from many other scholars, but specifically also here, Kenny Saul, these stereotypes influence 2 psychological mechanisms, which are going to further disadvantage students and philosophers who belong to underrepresented groups from pursuing philosophy. One of these mechanisms is stereotype threat, whereby members of a group which are stereotypically perceived as less able to perform at a given task tend to underperform at this task. So since the stereotypical philosopher is perceived as a white male, people of different gender or race are likely to underperform in philosophy. The second mechanism that Saul identifies is implicit bias, where people who self-identify as being unprejudiced often exhibit subconscious or implicit biases that follow past or present cultural stereotypes. In philosophy, that's going to mean that non-white male students and authors may be treated more dismissively, or as less able, or be evaluated more harshly, and so on and so forth. And we see kind of the practical application of this very regularly. So yeah, this is just some background, the sort of data that we are currently following, but also that we hope to add to. One thing that I have not mentioned is data on disability in philosophy, which is radically under-researched. That's something that we hope to just, well, just because we don't have the data, we're not going to investigate it. No, we're hoping to be able to put together research teams to gather the data. But an important sort of commitment of the DRL is to be research driven and data driven. But that doesn't mean just follow blindly the data, because as we know, data itself can be biased. So that's something that we're very much looking into. And I just want to, add that caveat that this is also not perfect in the first place, methodologically speaking. Oh, I see there's something in the chat. Oh, sorry, it's Bjorn saying that please feel free to put any question in the chat. Yes, please feel free to put any question or interrupt me at any time. Great, so now I'm gonna talk a little bit about what we do. The main point of the diversity reading list is to be a list, as it's implied. And we kind of follow the model of, or well, try to position ourselves as an alternative to the research database fill papers, if you're familiar with it. So what we aim to do is sort of collect texts by authors who do not identify as cisgender male or who are of a non-white racial background. Again, as I said, we're trying to incorporate or include other identities in the list, but we are sort of going about this with caution and with, care. So this is currently where we are. We don't, in the list, as you'll see in a sec, I'll show you the website, we don't say what is the identity of the author of a given text. First of all, because usually people can just look that up easily. There's a link to the person's website if they want to, but that's also to protect, people's privacy if that's relevant, or also to avoid people coming to the list with a very sort of quota mindset of, I need to add, a woman on philosophy of science and a, Black man on philosophy of Kant, and just picking and choosing to add to their syllabi. That's hopefully really not the point of the list. So we don't think that's a relevant piece of information to add there. If it's on the list, it has been checked by editors and has been enhanced and sort of built into something that is helpful for teaching. So which is why we produce, we provide difficulty level, the type of use that each entry could provide for somebody wanting to add that entry to their syllabus, and importantly, teaching comments. So I'll show you a little bit how that works. So this is the diversity reading list website. When you hit the search button, it's not the entry page, but this is our category tree right here, which I'll talk about our efforts to recategorize this in a second. But you have loads of ways of searching through the database. I mean, we currently have almost 1,600 entries. So of course we want to make that as easy and accessible as possible. And when you click on a given entry, so you've got your keywords, your categories, sometimes some use syllabi that, so you can see it in context. And what you'll find is a teaching comment here that is precisely meant to show the teachers what this text might replace, in what kind of context it might be put, what might be gained from it, and so on and so forth. So that's how we design these with that in mind. And of course, you can also search by recommended use difficulty and so on. We're pretty kind of open about, what medium might be an appropriate source for the DRL. So we've often published blog posts or sort of more public-facing texts and so on and so forth. But yeah, so this is kind of how the list works. And oh, sorry, Bjorn, you had a question.
No, there's a question in the chat. Were the BPOC and female identifying percentages for faculty or graduate numbers? I missed that in my notes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, let me go back. It was general. So it's a collective of recently PhDs, recently graduated. So it's not students. It's at least in this kind of report. For BPA, we have more student reports as well as faculty. And oh, sorry. So yeah, I definitely please direct you to the About page and to these sources to kind of unpack a little bit some of this. As you know, of course, it's hard to represent precisely what's going on. But the BPA/SWIP report is definitely the most comprehensive piece of data that we've seen recently, or sort of collection of data, sorry. Yeah. So this is really how the list works, and I'll move on because I've got a few other things I want to talk about. But this is really the core of the project and how it really started. These entries are contributed by the members of the public. There's a contribution sort of page that really explains how you can easily do that, and then they're on the back end sort of checked, enhanced by editors. Bjorn was one of the editors at some point. So there's really sort of a quality control that goes through the project. And yeah, so that's how they're growing. The editors often themselves add the entries. Sometimes we had sort of funding to add a sort of block of entries on a specific topic, and so on and so forth. Of course, we try to not kind of just give people the list and then here you go, diversify your syllabus, reread the canon. Because again, it's not a numbers game, it's not a quota game. So we try to offer at least, well, conceptual tools to help teachers approach the task of diversifying their syllabi, and practical tips on how to incorporate this in a module outline, and in slides and in lectures and so on. And also certain pitfalls and backfires in syllabus diversification, because I think that's quite important to talk about this as well. So this is what you will find on our Teach page. Again, this is stuff that was really collected through other people's work, and generous with their time. So here are some conceptual points about how to even start approaching diversifying a syllabi. And Lavelle Anderson and Verena Erlenbusch propose different models on how to do this, on how to really reread a canon, and offered example syllabi, so you can see this everywhere on each sort of model, pros and cons, and kind of sort of offering people a choice of how to approach this. Obviously, most people are not gonna, who use the DRL, are not really gonna have a really deep think about what is the particular model they're endorsing when diversifying their syllabi. But we hope at least, that there is thought and care put behind it. So we offer the resources regardless. Here, Catherine Jenkins and Jenny Soul offered loads of really nice practical tips on how to do that. I mean, could be as simple as using full names rather than initials on syllabi, just little signals, and so on and so forth. So this is, again, something that, I unfortunately don't have a lot of time to go over, but I wanted to point out that this is something we also offer. And here we've got Ian James Kidd had a really lovely paper on backfires and trade-offs in curricular diversification, based on examples of his efforts at the University of Nottingham, in particular modules that he sort of designed and taught. And he pointed out how in a module where he wanted to sort of include more philosophers of color, especially from Indian, Chinese, Japanese, and Afro-Caribbean traditions of thought, this actually came at the cost of, gender diversity, for instance. So he talks about different sort of trade-offs and how they thought about doing this rather than just doing it and sweeping it under the rug. And also certain backfires that might occur in these sort of general efforts, two of which that he points out are neophilia, which is an assertive preference for novel topics, themes, and figures, coupled to open refusal or reluctance to study historical figures and debates unless they are of clear pertinence to contemporary concerns. With this, I mean, unfortunately, a large swaths of history of philosophy would then be sort of dismissed. Xenophilia as well, and uncritical enthusiasm for culturally other topics, themes, and figures. So yeah, just general things to also think about when practicing and putting into practice, implementing really diversification efforts. So that's at least some of the things that we offer, so that the list is not just used uncritically and again as a way of just hitting certain quotas on course requirements, which more and more universities have these days. But as we know, I don't think these efforts really count towards a genuine care for diversification and inclusivity. So this is kind of what we offer teachers of philosophy, and how we sort of attempt to support them and help them. Now, we also more recently launched a more student-focused rather than educator-focused part of the project. And here the thought was, well, it is great to, consider that, women, for instance, who might be still working on very traditional aspects of philosophy also need to be represented. But challenging the canon also entails for us challenging certain notions about what gets to be called philosophy and taught as such. So it's not merely about who gets to do philosophy, it's about what is philosophy in the first place. And a hypothesis we're working with is the idea that the extent to which the syllabus is diverse and inclusive determines the extent to which certain underrepresented demographics engage or continue to engage with the discipline. This seems maybe perhaps to you kind of like a trivial statement, or obvious at least, that and we often hear sort of anecdotal evidence that some philosophy students who belong to underrepresented demographics don't feel represented by their syllabus, they don't feel like this stuff is for them, and so on and so forth. But we're really trying to establish a stronger connection between these two aspects. I think that's a very important part of the research that we're attempting to do, and that I'm hopefully will be able to do with the University of Manchester in the future as well, as I was mentioning briefly before. But yeah, so with this in mind, the Blueprints project was sort of started. Once again, with some background research, which this time we conducted. One of our volunteers, Annie McCallion, who got some knowledge exchange funding from AHRC, decided to conduct a systematic survey of what is taught in philosophy departments in the UK. She managed to actually collect a lot more data, but we've analyzed so far only the top 10 philosophy departments in the UK as they were identified in the Times Higher Education ranking. Of these 10 philosophy departments at undergraduate level, there are 377 modules that were taught, and we went and analyzed what these modules contained, and whether they were about a particular philosopher or what the themes were, and so on and so forth. And what we found is not great. This is really the pared down analysis. I again on the link that I right here that I was giving you has the more sort of detailed analysis of the data, but only 3.8% of these modules focus on any philosophical tradition other than the Western analytic tradition. Only 3.1% focus on any of the four broad topics of class, colonialism, race, or gender. 10.6% have any non-token content relating to class, colonialism, race, or gender at all. We included the non-token content bit here because, as we know, a lot of people sometimes try to just, shoehorn a diversity topic in the last week of their module to sort of signal that, well, they're doing what needs to be done, but they don't really care about it. So we classified that as token content. So actually less of these modules have non-token content. And 0% of the courses which were about specific philosophers were about someone who was not a white man. In 2022, some postgraduate students who are the diversity inclusion officers of the British and Irish Postgraduate Philosophical Association, BIPA, decided to sort of reproduce the research for Irish taught postgrad programs, so master's degrees, really. There are obviously less of those, so they managed to look at and analyze the data for all of these modules and all of these programs. So there was 58 modules in total, and it looks a little bit better than what we saw for the UK programs, but still only 1.7 of all the modules focus on any of the four broad topics of class, colonialism, race, or gender. There was one module that was partially focused on feminist philosophy, another one that was on professional ethics. More than 11% of all modules focus on any philosophical tradition other than Western analytic. And 15 of the 58 modules were about a specific philosopher or a group of specific philosophers. And of those, 83% were dedicated to white men, 10% to white women, which was one module devoted to Stein and one partially devoted to modern feminist philosophers, and 6.7 to non-white men, in particular Japanese philosophers. So, I mean, again, this is research that we hope to be able to kind of take on the road and analyze in other places, and to update as well, see if they're, as something that we hope to be able to do, for instance, look at a particular university and see if, there's been a change since 2021. But yeah, based on this, to get to the point, based on this research, the Reedy Group blueprints was born. So to go back to the website again, this is found in this tab, which looks like this. So here you can see our more detailed research, and I encourage you to look at it. And the idea here was, okay, these modules are not taught at university. We know that students want them to be taught or are generally dissatisfied. What can we do, aside from holding a complete revolution of the university system and taking hold of, teaching provisions? We can provide tools for the students themselves to kind of take matters into their own hand and start a reading group on something that they don't get access to in their regular course provision. So the idea here is anything, again, broadly related to class, colonialism, race, and gender. And we create these sort of pre-packaged reading groups with, again, different number of weeks, different levels of difficulties, where we provide a sort of introduction and different resources organized by weekly content, weekly topics. So the students just follow the resources. They have some study questions to guide them. And yeah, this obviously, is entirely flexible in terms of who uses it, how they use it. We've had some great reports of people using it as it's intended as a group. But we also have, incidentally, reports of teachers using it to basically sort of recreate courses. They're essentially sort of mini syllabi in and of themselves. Bjorn has provided us with two great blueprints here. That's his latest one on comparative introduction to the philosophy of non-human animals. But yeah, we're hoping to kind of offer as broad of a range as possible, and we are currently sort of publishing them twice a year in different batches. We also sort of provide a PDF that can be taken like a course outline, basically, for people to just follow. So that's the idea behind the blueprints. It's honestly been one of our sort of more popular kind of projects, and something I'm personally really excited about. The idea that we just can offer this quality of content for free to anybody who would like to follow them and learn about these topics is really, really satisfying. We've got a really broad range of people creating these. We have a broad range of sources. It's not always readings, it's often videos and artworks and so on and so forth. So it's a really completely different approach to pedagogy that, I am really excited about. So that's also part of what we hope to do. Now, I've also, I've told you that we're data driven. We're also research driven in perhaps a more traditional philosophical sense, where, yes, we're embedded within a tradition that has this publication system, this peer review system, where in order to be taken seriously, you need to sort of write a research paper, publish it, and present it, and so on and so forth. And sometimes the fact is, it's the better medium for us to sort of express what we want to express, because the list is what it is. User friendliness and sort of making it digestible and accessible is extremely important to us. But sometimes these really complex forms of exclusivity and marginalization deserve to be looked at in a research paper and to be sort of investigated. So in 2020, Simon, who's my co-manager, wrote a paper critiquing or exploring how existing systems for indexing philosophy, such as the Phil Papers database, entrenches these marginalization through the very way it categorizes papers, and the way the category tree is itself structured. He pointed out all sorts of examples. So for instance, there was a category philosophy of science, and then a category philosophy of feminism, gender, and some other stuff, and then as a subcategory feminist philosophy, and then as a subcategory of that, feminist philosophy of science, right? But that wasn't categorized under philosophy of science to begin with, right? So that's a clear case where feminist philosophy of science as a topic is being marginalized in virtue of where it's put in the category tree, right? And there were loads of examples of this, and Simon's paper is really great at sort of pointing out what's going on here. So I really direct you towards it. But we decided recently to follow up on this paper by sketching out a positive proposal. What would, given current constraints, given constraints, what would an indexing system that does not fall into these marginalization pitfalls would look like, in a way that remains efficient, easy to use, easy to implement, and so on and so forth. So this is a recent paper that Simon, Quentin Farr, who's one of our editors and volunteers, and myself have written. It's currently under production at the Journal of the American Philosophical Association. But if you'd like an advanced copy, I would be more than happy to forward that to you. But basically, to tell you a little bit about what we say in this paper, very briefly again, because yeah, I don't want to overtake your time, but we've identified certain desiderata, things that we want to have in order for an indexing system to be fair and to not be marginalizing. So first, we want categories themselves to be ordered in a value-less way, or at least in a way that doesn't present any kind of chosen specific value. So for instance, in fill papers, the first category, it's not categorized, the tree is not alphabetized. The first category is metaphysics and epistemology. The second broad category is value theory. And then 2 categories down, you have philosophical traditions. This might have been done completely, innocently and, without any kind of particular thought to it, but it does give an appearance of priority, right? I mean, given the founders of Phil Paper's research profile, David Chalmers and David Bourget, who were metaphysicians and epistemologists, I guess it makes sense that metaphysics, epistemology, and language is the first top category. But it's not really justified. Anyway, so it's a very simple fix. Why is there some kind of ordering system that's value-laden in that way? Second, equal depth for equal importance. Top categories obviously have many subcategories and then often subcategories. And the way that this is structured internally can give the appearance of complexity or depth or something like this. So for instance, just to give you another example from Phil Papers, why is history of Western philosophy a top category that you see on the front page? But any historical categories for other traditions, such as, for instance, history of Confucianism, those are lumped together under a different top category, which is philosophical traditions, and often appear as subcategories of different things, right? That also seems to be a very specific choice that has been made, which presents the idea that history of Western philosophy has more depth, has more importance than other historical approaches to different traditions. Thirdly, equal division for equal complexities. For equal complexity, again, this is the idea that the way that subcategories are structured gives a certain impression. So the more subcategories a category has, it will appear more complex and more rich. And yeah, that's something we see all the time again in fill papers. Decentralized naming, again, this is something I pointed out to when I talked about the feminist philosophy of science example. But why is there a top category for ethics and then a subcategory of Chinese ethics, which is put then in philosophical traditions, not under ethics? That gives the impression that Chinese ethics is not considered ethics, it's considered something other, right? That also does not seem to be appropriate, or, I mean, it's entirely arbitrary and marginalizes further certain topics, right? Finally, careful or no use of miscellaneous categories. That's something you see everywhere in fill papers. They use miscellaneous categories to kind of just jam any kind of content is seen as difficult to categorize given the existing canon. So oftentimes a lot of marginalized content. A lot of feminist texts end up under miscellaneous categories. A lot of, I mean, for fill papers, a lot of continental philosophy ends up being shoved in miscellaneous categories, and so on and so forth. So these are things that we don't want, and that's why we want these sort of desiderata for the a better indexing system. Sorry. So the proposal, again, very, very, very briefly, I'm sketching kind of some main news item, really. What we want to do is the main category are going to be about topics, so which we're going to order alphabetically because that's at least the least value laden system we can sort of think of. So the general structure would involve including a broader range of topics as top level categories, still while limiting this range to a practically usable number, and removing miscellaneous and figure or tradition or time-based categories. So anything like history of Western philosophy would not be a general topic for us. And yeah, finally, as I said, arranging all categories at all levels alphabetically. So our current proposal for what we think are maybe a workable number of top topic categories are aesthetics, epistemology, logic, metaphilosophy, metaphysics, moral philosophy, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, political philosophy, and social philosophy. Then expanding, I mean, this is all completely reworkable depending on suggestions and so on and so forth. But yeah, expanding then a category would reveal sub-level topics. So for instance, if social philosophy was expanded, you might have things like philosophy of class, philosophy of culture, philosophy of disability, philosophy of education, and so on. So this is just topic level. Then what we would like to implement is our filters on these. Time, tradition, and figures in particular as filters, which would not be included within the topic category. So once you've sort of selected your topic, you have a bunch of filters that you can apply, kind of like, a shopping website, right? You want your shoes to be in a size 6, brown, leather, and so on, and you just sort of take everything you want to find. So for time, users could simply type in a date range, or use a slider feature with a start date and end with present. We don't have a specific feeling about what the start date has to be for when philosophy started to happen. But yeah, for traditions, we envisage sort of a multiple selection tool so that you could pick different traditions, which would then give you both everything that, applies to each category, but also things that have been classified under both categories at the same time. And we would like to divide traditions among geographical traditions, and a tentative list would be something like Central Asian, East Asian, European, North African, North American, Oceanian, South American, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Western Asian. Again, up for revision. And a different type of tradition, which could then be paired with your geographical traditions, would be something like, methodological traditions. Again, a very tentative list, but analytic, comparative / intercultural, critical, which would involve things like critical race, feminist, Marxist, post-colonialist, postmodernist, and so on. Cultural, African, Caribbean, Hebraic, Indigenous, Persian, and so on, which we think is as different from geographic, obviously, because some people could be practicing a certain methodology without belonging to the geographical region where they are, where that might correspond. Hermeneutical / phenomenological, historical, pragmatic, and religious. And finally, for figures, we also envisage a sort of multiple selection tool. That way you could have texts by a certain philosopher, but also texts about a certain philosopher, for instance. We're not very satisfied with the standard or the sort of what we've decided. We're going to basically, how are we going to pick which figures are on the list? That's a difficult question. Currently, where we're thinking is if biographical work has been done, then it's that person can count as a figure. That way, that would allow us to not count every single philosopher that's ever lived as a figure. But yeah, that's not something we necessarily are deeply satisfied with. But as I said, again, we're sort of trying to manage user friendliness and implementability as well. Anyway, so I have not completely misrepresented the papers that my co-authors and I worked on together. I hope they would be happy with what I've said. But yeah, we also address a lot of different sort of complex issues with sort of, going about indexing philosophy in the first place. Many trade-offs, some that we are, some that we aren't sort of willing to make, such as, if we're going to have a time slider, are we using the Western calendar? That's already old, that's a choice. In, figures, are we using Western alphabet or not? Are we going to, classify Confucius as Confucius or, no. So we're trying to work with a sort of flexible model that will allow for both, so that users can find what they're looking for, but also we're not saying that's necessarily the right way of indexing things or categorizing things. We also address, among other things, the extent to which certain traditions can be understood as having central figures, and the extent to which a given philosopher can be said to belong to a certain geographical tradition, for instance. And yeah, the extent to which something like this is implementable and user-friendly. So that's our hope, is to sort of provide a model that is as broad as possible, while being as implementable as possible and flexible as possible, that potentially could work for other indexing systems that are not just the DRL. So of course, we give example of what we would do for the DRL, but this is something we hope could be used by other indexing systems like fill papers. Right, I've talked for a while, so I'm just going to talk very briefly about the who, the final component, which is the DRL team. So is the DRL, or at least our hope, Simon and I, is to sort of make the DRL as a sort of community platform, really, for anyone who cares about what we're doing, really. This entails a lot of different things, but particularly creating roles within the team that can be rewarding for various reasons. For people who care, it is rewarding, but also rewarding in terms of people are going to invest time and efforts and resources in this. Given the current constraints of academic philosophy, to what extent are we helping them, and to what extent are we sort of hindering them? So we're trying to stay very, very mindful and conscious of certain social effects in the practice of diversifying philosophy, We know that oftentimes these efforts fall on those who are already marginalized or already, in casual roles and so on and so forth. So yeah, we're trying to like think about this as well. Just to show you, now that's the recruitment speech now. If you're interested in participating or being part of the team, here's Bjorn. He is passionate about promoting philosophy, which talks to all human voices. Anyway, this is our sort of volunteer page when you are not yet a volunteer but are hoping to join. So we give you some information about what this entails, some of our beautiful current volunteers and past volunteers. And once you join the team, once you're interested, you will then have a private interface to hopefully engage with the community and understand what it is that you can do. So once you have a profile, this is what happens. We've tried to conceive of two different roles within the team: editors and broadly collaborators. Editors are basically taking care of some of those broad categories we've seen. Their role is to sort of make sure the entries are looking pretty and the teaching comments are as helpful as possible. They source different entries, kind of like Phil Papers. Phil Papers has designated editors for each of its categories. So that's obviously will change depending on how we manage to recategorize our indexing system. But yeah, so we have a small team of editors who all have a certain category based on their AOS to care for. And then we have a broad team of collaborators who do all sorts of things, adding content, create blueprints, organize events, promote, conduct research as well. So yeah, here's Bjorn again. But yeah, so that's us. And yeah, we try to sort of support each other, not just in the kind of nice touchy-feely ways, but also with what really speaks, namely funding. So that's something we're really mindful as well of. Some of our editors have stipends, and we try to provide as much help as possible in sourcing funding. When we get some ourselves, we give it directly to our volunteers and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I've talked about for a while about all of this and how it works, and hopefully you're on board with the project, and hopefully you have thoughts about how we can make it better and more inclusive. So thanks a lot, and please get in touch, and I'm really looking forward to hear your thoughts and your suggestions. So thanks again.